Okay, so hello everybody. This is Tom Sherrington here and Oliver. Say hello, Oliver.
Hi, how'd you do? Let's go.
Yeah, we're here to introduce our lovely new book, Teaching Walkthroughs, which is soon to hit the shops and be available on Amazon and via John Catt. So we're very excited about it. And we're just going to give you an overview in this short recording of our Zoom conversation to tell you what's in it. So this is what the front cover looks like. It's essentially introducing you to one of our key characters, who we call Chloe, and we've got we're going to show you what some of the pages look like and what the purpose of the book is. So I'm going to hand over to Oliver, who's going to talk you through the first section, and then I'll come back to you to talk about some of the details. So over to you, Oliver.
Okay. Can you click the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, this kind of sounds strange, but it may not be so strange when you know that I'm someone who's first started teaching in 1976. I think there's something called professional amnesia going on. We don't seem to have a system whereby all the great techniques that we've learned are effective are readily available to teachers all the time. So in the last few years, it seems that the teaching profession has rediscovered dual coding. Of course, it's something that's been around for decades. Similarly, right at the moment, Professor Paul Kirshner is reintroducing to teachers the notion of David Ausubel's advanced organizer from the 1960s. Wonderfully effective, research backed it up, yet it's not in use, it's not known. Similarly, you'd have seen the use of the word schema. When I was teaching, it's probably the most important word that teachers knew, and then kind of sometime in the 80s and 90s it disappeared, and then lo and behold, oh, there's this word schema that's really useful. And direct instruction, you know, I'm one of the last standing people who used direct instruction in the 80s in special schools, and now it's been rediscovered. It's great that it's been rediscovered, but it shouldn't have been lost in the meantime. Okay, and how many other techniques and approaches that were really effective that we've lost, which will reappear and become the latest thing? So this is really a reason why we had the impetus and the motivation to create the walkthroughs, just to make them available and not lost, available to teachers. And there's another problem, which is lethal mutation. I don't know whether you know that Dylan Williams adopted this term because he identified the phenomenon where you go along to a course and it's really motivating. The teacher or the professor describes teaching techniques, and then you listen intently and you take notes, and you don't for one moment assume that you may have slightly misunderstood something. You just assume you have 100% perfect understanding. Then you go back to school, you try it out, you tweak it, and then you enthusiastically chat about it to your colleague, who also interprets what you've said, that consciously or unconsciously. Oh, Oliver doesn't do that bit well, so I'll just change it here. And Dylan says that after about 3, 4, possibly 5 such iterations, Chinese whispers, very probably the original the technique in the end doesn't have any of the original essential attributes that made it effective. It's become something else. Now, there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's really useful that teachers adapt techniques. But when it's serial and it changes and mutates so much, we never know what it is. We don't have a name for it. It changes too often. And then communicating about it is different because people have different experiences of what it is. So one way we can get around that is actually, and there's a long history of visual instructions. So I chose this one, as you'll see on the next slide in a minute. It came out every week in the Daily Telegraph in the 1940s as a real classic in terms of visual instructions. So let's have a look what Adam the gardener teaches their gardening readers. There you are. You'll find this is not much different to the format that we adopted for the walkthroughs. So this is just one side. On the other side of the spread, they would have another 2 or 3. Is a sequence of behaviours, of actions, one after the other, which are instructive on their own, but insufficient without the words. And the words are really useful, and the words are insufficient without the diagrams. So it's the mixture of the words and diagram that make it really effective. You learn a lot. It's interesting. You can remember it. You can refer to it. Thanks, Tom. And this is just an example, and I'm going to, on the next slide shortly, I'm going to give you the explanation by an expert as why diagrams are drawn this way. So over the last years, I picked up this wonderful word, verisimilitude, lifelike. There isn't often very much benefit to making the instructional illustrations lifelike, because we need to simplify it for the reason that Barbara Tversky explains on the next slide. So it's not about being lifelike. I mean, we know from perception, there's enough research shown that we don't identify an object by its internal characteristics. That's to say, its color, its texture, its shading. We identify it by its outline, its outer border. And so we need to make the outer border really clear. We need to make sure that the information that doesn't give us any information is eliminated, cut out. So the only thing we see is meaningful. And if we look at the next slide, Tom, this is just one short excerpt from one of the steps in the walkthroughs. And you'll see our students are clearly, boldly depicted, and they're floating. There's no chair because the chair is meaningless. I've drawn the table because it makes sense, because we have these helicopters. We don't have helicopters in classrooms, do we? So these mini helicopters come in and they provide the different formats of resources for a particular stage of a technique. So the meaning, particularly alongside the text. And then there we have representing the teachers. We have Chloe and Chuka, who demonstrate the techniques throughout the book. There'll be characters we'll get to know very closely. Chloe and Chuka. Thanks. And the purpose to which we've focused the walkthroughs is instructional coaching. You know, over the last decade or so, we've had coaching in schools and it's had many benefits, but there's been a growing sense of frustration that it may not have achieved its aims with regard teachers. And so Sam Sims has collected some research to show the efficacy, and he argues superiority of instructional coaching compared to life coaching, executive coaching, where the coach doesn't need to be competent nor know anything else, have great knowledge about the techniques that they're coaching. This one shows it's really effective when the person coaching has this knowledge. So if we go on and start looking at instructional coaching. So Jim Knight at Kansas University has been engaged in instructional coaching for over 20 years and has a whole array of data to showing its effectiveness. And in his definition, this is not coaching where the coaching doesn't know anything about teaching. On the contrary, they need to be able to demonstrate expertise and need to have a whole vast range of knowledge. And so on the next 3 slides, I'm going to show you 3 particular sets of actions and attributes that Jim Knight says is essential to be an effective instructional coach. Let's have a look at the first one, Tom.
Yeah.
So you can't be an expert and teach a range of different techniques to your teachers if you don't have a repertoire. So it's exactly what we provide. So I know the instructional coaches in Kansas University that Jim Knight works for have at least half a week's timetable that devoted to it. Most of our coaches, from what I hear in schools, don't have that. So they need this repertoire. It's immediately available to them. It's constantly available to them and to the teachers. Next one, Tom. So to arrive at this repertoire, they just need to keep reading. So we're not saying teachers shouldn't read, but we're giving you a head start. And lastly, they should be creating these one-page summaries, which kind of is exactly what the walkthroughs are. So briefly showing you the reasons and the purpose and the value of the walkthroughs. Let's have a look at them now, Tom. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Oh, no, we haven't finished this. Okay, so Just want to go back and just show me the 2 points first. Are you allowed to, can you just go back first?
Yeah. Let's focus on this
Yeah.
one first. Yeah.
So in any coaching, the crucial part is the feedback. And, you know, there's been a lot of work devoted to how to more effectively give feedback, but I think insufficient attention to the experience of receiving it. So this is a typical dynamic of giving feedback. Two people opposite, and the person giving feedback, no, it's kind of a difficult situation. So they make themselves very human and warm, and they gaze not too long because it's oppressive, eye-to-eye contact. And yet it's problematic for the person receiving it, because whatever our intention and however nice and skillful the person giving the feedback, the person receiving it, it's all personal. And so that dynamic is essentially problematic, for which a solution is to add the third point. So in addition to the two people's focus, we introduce the third point, which is often a visual. So now instead of sitting opposite each other, they sit side by side. That in itself makes an enormous difference in terms of the tone and muscular relaxation. And now the coach giving the feedback talks to their colleague via the third point, which is the walkthrough. Now, the important point here is that we now create a gap between the message, which is the comments directed towards the walkthrough, and the messenger. And equally, the person receiving the feedback, in a sense, saves face, because the feedback is related via the walkthrough. And so the comments are behavioral. We really can say the emphasis is on the teaching and not the teacher. Let me finish off with a couple of quotes that kind of sum this up. Now, to show you that we have professional amnesia, Eric Lunzer was involved in a school's council project in the 1980s called DARTS, a wonderful strategy of developing English. And here he's talking about the relationship, the communication between a teacher and a student. Communication, because we're looking at the object and we're not making a direct communication. And I think I have one more slide. That the person who taught me this some 20 years ago, and it's interesting, you may not agree with the use of this word volatile, or rather my application of the word volatile. I'm not saying coaching feedback sessions are volatile, but underneath there, they have always the potential to upset and demoralize the teacher. And so with that possibility, the 3 points, adding the visual component to the communication, avoids that completely and allows the teacher receiving the feedback to be just that bit more objective, a bit more calm, a bit more rational, and look and see what the points are. Tom, I think the walkthroughs now.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to bring up me on the computer here. So hopefully people can see. Oliver's explained brilliantly the way it works and the reason. So let's just talk about what it looks like in context. I'm just trying to get this thing to work so that people can see the right amount of people. I'm struggling with that slightly. Okay, Oliver, you're going to be in the shot the whole time, so I hope you don't mind. Just in case you drift off there. Here's one of them. There are 3 sections. We call them why, what, and how. And one of the aspects of the why section is research papers. So, for example, we condense the Marge paper that comes from Arthur Shimomura into 5 steps. So here this is one example of that. He talks about his model for learning, which is the acronym spells out motivate, attend, relate, generate, and evaluate. And it's actually originally a 50-page PDF, but you can access it by looking at the images that Oliver has produced, and then it gives a summary of what the book's about. And for each one of them, we just give a kind of the essential part. So here, in motivate, the idea that we have to support students to focus their mental effort, if you like, around the learning in hand, and that Shimomura explains that really well. How using storytelling, for example, is a good way of doing that. The need for attention, so how we actually get students to pay attention to the information at hand. And Shimomura uses this quite nice 3 C's: categorize, compare, and contrast. So we capture that. Relate is to do with schema building. Here you've got a very good example where the diagrams, the illustrations that Oliver's done. So here, there you have Chuka pointing at the images, and we feel that, you know, when you stop to look at something like that, you could read the text, of course, and it just says relate. But then if you stop to think, well, what's the diagram saying? And it's clearly saying we've got to add existing knowledge, we chunk it up, we assimilate it, and we've got this new schema. And the visual is a reference point for you thinking about the content. Now, of course, you could go and read the whole paper, but we found that, you know, a lot of teachers just don't have the time for that. And at the very least, this is going to perhaps stimulate some interest in some of these books that people haven't read yet. And if they haven't had the time, they will get the general sense of them. So that the punchy summary with the visual, I think that's a really good example of how that works. Generate is a really important concept. It comes from a lot of our thinking about walkthroughs, that teachers need to engineer activities for students to get information out of their long-term memory into their working memory, to, you know, maybe tell each other what they've learned, to test themselves, to close the books and basically use the knowledge they've gained rather than constantly absorbing it from external sources. So that's what Shimomura talks about. And then you need to know whether your schema is secure, is accurate, so they need to evaluate that knowledge. And this sort of generate, evaluate cycle is something which I think is important. So we try to capture that. So that's just one example of a research paper summarized in 5 steps. We've also got examples from Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School, Ron Berger's Ethic of Excellence, and Dylan Williams' Embedded Formative Assessment in this particular collection. Plus also, we've done Rosenshine's Principles again, although many of you will know we did that before, but this is in our walkthrough style, and you'll get another version of that that spans over 2 walkthroughs. When we get into something more, you can see, can you spot the deliberate mistake? I can see the 3 L's in calling. This is a good practice, Oliver. Can you see that?
This is
like, we're still editing our slides. These slides, by the way, will be all available to people when you subscribe to our whole walkthroughs package, which will be coming along with the books. But here, this is a specific behavioral thing that you would do in a lesson, part of a questioning strategy. So cold calling is a perfect example of where we get lethal mutation. You can have a group of people sitting around a table all saying, yeah, I'm doing cold calling. But because the definition of what it is vague, not everyone necessarily is even talking about the same thing. And somebody thinks they're doing cold calling and they're doing an entirely different thing to everybody else, or to what the trainer was originally explaining to them. But here we spell it out. So we have the walkthrough, the 5 images you can see there. So at a simple level, the headings just tell you the steps. Ask the class a question, give thinking time, then select somebody to respond, then engage with those responses, respond to answers, and then select another student to respond and do it again. So the flow is quite specific, that you ask the question first and give thinking time before you select, and it's the emphasis on the selecting. So then we will go through those things in more detail. You can look at it at an overview level, which is quite nice to look at the flow of the 5 steps. So we think walkthroughs work at that level, but we can also then focus on each step one by one. So the detail of this, how do you ask the question? Do you know what sort of questions do you ask? Are you making sure every single student knows it could be them that could respond, so therefore they're all engaged in that question? And we haven't directed that question at a specific individual. We've definitely asked it to everybody. You can see that from the image that's implied. Thinking time. So this is a classic teacher issue, isn't it? That we ask a question and want an answer straight away, rather than making people pause and think. And, you know, we're not trying to just reward the fastest respondents. We're trying to reward students, you know, for thinking hard, and that needs to involve everybody. So that, I think that's a great image of the thinking time. And when you're engaged in a coaching conversation around this, that might be a specific thing a teacher needs to work on. Are you allowing your students time to think before you dive in to get an answer? Select someone to respond. So who, you know, do we have hands up and calling out? It's still a very common default in a lot of lessons, that students just call out answers or put their hand up, and the teacher doesn't control very well who answers, and therefore some students never answer because they don't really have to, and they're never picked, and they don't pick themselves. So being the teacher who selects from people without their hands up is really, really useful, and that's an important idea. So we try to model that, and there's a bit of text in there that says, James, what were you thinking? So we try to include a bit of narration in some of the walkthroughs, so we give a bit of a feeling for it. You're not trying to catch people out when you ask a question, you're trying to invite them in. So James, what were you thinking? Is a kind of invitational question. Then we respond. So we don't ask a question just to sort of get an answer and move on, get an answer and move on. We listen to that. And this links, when you see the bold on these slides and in the book, this links into other walkthroughs. So probing question is another walkthrough. Process questions is another walkthrough. Say it again better is another walkthrough, and so on. So they just kind of interrelate these ideas, which we think was important. And in the electronic version of the book, which is going to be made available to people who subscribe, these will all be hyperlinked. You just click on those and then it will take you from one stage to the next. And finally, you then carry on. So the whole point of a questioning exchange is that cold calling is about one student. It's about getting lots of responses from different students, and that we've seen all that. So this is a very good example of the walkthroughs. The next set is things we want to focus on in this sort of short video now is the adapt. So throughout the book, on the bottom right of each page, you'll see this adapt, and it's actually an acronym which includes itself. So we're clear that there's a difference between lethal mutation, where everything just gets morphed into something else, into something different from what it started off as, and adaptation, which is applying a coherent idea into a context. And I think that's quite an important distinction to make. We're not saying, here are the rules, you must follow them. That would be unworkable, even if it was a good idea. It's just not going to happen. So our deliberately clean, generic, context-free walkthroughs invite you to say, well, what will this look like in my subject? And the adapt thing is designed to first ask you to attempt it, so have a go at it, then develop it. So add steps, maybe swap steps around. You without changing the actual thing, you're still thinking, do I do it in this way? I think adding additional steps is the main thing we're suggesting there. Adapt itself means to make it subject specific, context specific. So how does this work for my year 8 history class? That's what we're talking about. Then to practice it, and I'm seeing another typo there. Can you see that? It's great. This is our typo checker. This is good. We should perform all our slides live. And to practice it, it's really a mistake to evaluate how well something's going when you've only just done it once, because it's really your lack of fluency in using a technique is often the issue, not whether the technique itself is good. Of course, if it's too difficult, it's probably not the best bet. But definitely most things you do, including lots of questioning strategies, for example, you just do get better at them the more you do them. And that's what we're suggesting. And last of all, this is really key. If someone says to you, how is that strategy working? You don't just decide because it feels right and you just get a feeling. That's no good. You have to test it. And that means you have to use assessment knowledge. You have to see, are my students learning more? Am I getting deeper responses from them? Are they producing higher quality work? So that test means do that. So that's what that all means. And all of that is laid out in a walkthroughs, of its own. So there you can see, attempt, run through the 5 steps, develop, add more steps, make them more fine grained, more precise. Adapt, are you changing it to suit you? Practice it, put your adapted walkthrough into action, and test it. So that's in itself there. So that's what we're doing. So that's our the overview of our whole thing. What we're going to be doing is producing a website. So coming soon, probably in around about May, www.walkthroughs.co.uk. There'll be a shop. And on that, where you can not only just buy the book, but there are going to be subscription packages where people can, at an institution level, when you buy that, you'll get the slides for all of the walkthroughs for running your own CPD. There'll be the kind of with audio and without audio version. We're also going to be giving you the electronic version, so you can access that. I think that's the only way you'll be able to get hold of that.
And Tom,
t-shirts.
Tom,
You go.
In the slides, you'll be having additional speaker notes, teacher notes, won't you?
Yeah, that's right. So there'll be we'll be writing notes. So if you're doing some training in your school, you'll have the slides, but there'll be some notes to guide you about some of the main points to emphasize, and bringing in some sort of examples, which we haven't cluttered up the slides with lots and lots of detail. So we'll give as much support to people as possible. And our whole aim is that the book and the slides are part of a CPD package, which you can then roll out to whatever extent you want. And it could become the whole way you base your CPD around. It might just be something which some people will use. But we're really hoping that this instructional coaching thing kicks off where it doesn't exist, and the books become the kind of the main reference for that. And then, as it says on there, volumes 2 and 3. So we're already planning, for each of the 6 sections, there's more behavior management strategies, more questioning strategies, more explaining and modeling, and so on. And we'll feed them into future editions. We're going to do some more work on reading. So over the next couple of years, walkthroughs will be a growing and expanding range. And by the end of a couple of years' time, the whole thing will be done, and then you'll have everything you could possibly ever want. So look, thank you very much for listening to us. I think we're going to put this up on our Twitter feed, the WalkThrus Twitter, so you can watch it. And then the books will be available anytime soon. So thank you very much for listening, and let us know what you think when you finally get hold of the books and the CPD information. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.